What I've seen in groups that I think is also a form of scapegoating is a member gets loaded up with that psychic projections, but the group is really interested in keeping that member around. They don't want to push them out. In fact, they can almost be fiercely defensive of that member because they know that it's like the member in that dynamic is serving the group in this unhealthy way, but really like scratching an itch for the group effectively. They don't want to see that scapegoat leave. They want to keep that scapegoat present so that they don't have to face the discomfort and anxiety and the material that they're like projecting out onto that scapegoat.
You must be some kind of therapist.
Today, my guest is Brant Elwood. He's the author of Gods, Heroes, and Groups, Relational Dynamics Through Mythic Archetypes, which he wrote along with his co-author, Adon Moran. Brant has a background in social and organizational psychology and has worked in consulting, leadership, as well as therapeutic roles. Today, we're going to talk about unconscious group dynamics from the archetypal lens. Brant Elwood, so good to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie.
Thanks for joining me. I really appreciated you hopping on this so last minute. Usually these things take months to plan, and then I had the spontaneous opening, and you and I have never talked before. I'm not familiar with your work. I didn't have time to get familiar with your work, but I do know that you're friends with my friends, guys like Ryan Rogers and Jake Wiskershin, who I've enjoyed speaking with several times. So I'm so glad that you could join us today.
Yeah, great to be on. Those are some quality folks and some quality follows that you mentioned.
So before we get into it, what would you like people to know about your background that led you into this work?
Well, I would start with my career in the therapy world began in wilderness therapy, which I'm not sure how familiar your listeners would be at the moment. Certainly, some people who have spent a lot of time online will have run into the bad press that industry as a whole has gotten in the last 5 to 10 years. I think Paris Hilton was one of the big leaders and voices trying to, at least on the surface, get more oversight, more standards of best practices, which are good things. And kind of on the back end of that, there are a lot of folks that are directly, aggressively trying to take down all of these programs that work with teens out in the woods. And so I'd say that's a little bit overboard, but I say that because for some people, the idea of wilderness therapy is a charged topic. I did that between 2011 and 2015. I was a field guide for 4 years, which means I was sleeping in the woods half the time. I think I did like 800 days in the woods over that time period. It's immersive, powerful. It was a massive growing up experience for me as a young 20 something year old. I think I'd been through my college courses in psychology and thought maybe that meant I knew something. And then it was a rude awakening working with tough clients in like a pretty intense environment without a lot of backup. And so you learn very quickly in that environment. And I did the math and I ended up, I think 4 years of that job where you're working a shift on and a shift off equals about 10,000 waking hours of experience working with small groups. And so, it adds up pretty quickly. Um, I thought I would be a therapist for a long time and something tickled my brain and had me start thinking a little bit more about organizational culture. I was getting mentorship that was really growing me at that company at the time, and I was really fascinated by the fact that a really stellar staff could leave the company and things wouldn't fall apart. And it was this idea that there's this zeitgeist, there's this cultural element that is really special about that company at that time, and that kind of steered me more into this world of social organizational psychology, which is looking at group dynamics, unconscious roles in groups, leadership development, organizational culture. Um, and I was at grad school, I was exposed to the Tavistock. This is another charged topic. People may know about the Tavistock Clinic, which is not the organization I'm talking about, but the Tavistock Institute does these experiential conferences where you're looking at unconscious group dynamics in the middle, in the here and now. And it's very intense, very immersive work. And so I got exposed to that in grad school. And, um, it really pissed me off the first time. It was frustrating. And
Wait, you're not talking about a T group, are you?
they're similar. T groups have some similarities.
Oh,
Group relations conferences are what these are called. and they come from the work of Wilfred Bion and what he was doing with wounded soldiers in the ward, basically, during and after World War II. And so, we'll get all into this, but basically, I was just smart enough at that age in grad school to know that if something could piss me off that much in a weekend experiential conference, there's probably something for me to learn from it. And so I stuck with it. I went back and did another one, and I've made it every single year out to do some of these experiential conferences. And eventually, during the pandemic, when I had a bunch of free time, um, put pen to paper, wrote about these dynamics along with some of the post Jungian concepts that I'd found very compelling from the therapy work that we'd done, and the leadership roles that I'd held since then. And so Adon and I linked up through a virtual conference and realized we had a lot of similar interests and ended up taking on the project together and getting it published last year.
So you have this background in wilderness therapy, and it sounds like, know about some of the more extreme unethical things that have happened in the world of wilderness therapy, but your experience is mostly positive, if I hear that correctly.
Yeah, overwhelmingly positive. I can think of, I think, 2 or 3 kids out of the hundreds that I've worked with where I feel like, if I'm just being brutally honest, where I was like, I don't think I had a positive impact, the interaction with me. Like, I think that the things I was trying, the way I was trying to hold boundaries, trying to be, there's times where you have to really, like, be tough and hold strong boundaries and confront, um, and I can think of 2 or 3 kids where that went kinda sideways based on my skill levels or misconceptions or misreads of the situations where, nothing, like, horrible, but probably wasn't a great, just wasn't, like, a great experience. It wasn't where the way I would hold boundaries or the way I'd communicate, like, I'm sure, looking back, I was like, "Ah, that kid probably didn't feel the love. He felt like I was a tyrant." But out of hundreds, and one of the things that just shocked me so early on was watching some of the kids come in basically looking like zombies who've been playing, video games for 20 hours a day, on caffeine, stimulants, and other drugs, and um, doing very dangerous things outside before they came to treatment. Getting to watch the light return to their eyes. You take away those distractions. You give them some dependable, um, I don't want to say predictable, but like trustworthy structure, basic boundaries that are communicated assertively, and give them a set of tools for like expressing the emotions that come up and a safe place to talk about those things. And 8 weeks later, it's like the life is back in them. And so, you know, that's not an easy thing to quantify on like a paper test or anything per se. But when you see it a couple of times, at least for me, it made me a believer really quickly.
That's good to hear because I always idealized wilderness therapy, the idea of it. I hadn't been on either end of it except, just my own personal experiences feeling that being in the wilderness can be personally therapeutic, but I never got to do wilderness therapy. Um, but I always had fantasies of how impactful it could be. And then it was disheartening to hear some of the stuff that's been coming out recently about how abusive some of these environments have been in reality. And when you describe some of these kids being zombified, I talk to parents of adolescents and young adults every day who have failure to launch, who spend too much time online, who don't have enough responsibility or life experience. And I can imagine how something like that could be so transformational for them. So it brings me joy to hear that. As far as you're aware, the program that you used to work for, are they still doing well?
Yeah, they're one of the few actually. I don't mind naming them. It's Blue Ridge Therapeutic Wilderness, and I mean, I really look back at that time as I was in my late 20s, so this was like late development. But that was when I like became an adult, basically, learning things, assertive communication, accountability, how to show up basically in relationships, how to recognize when my own insecurities or fears were starting to steer the ship, and how that would, it very subtly change the energy I would bring to these relationships. And nobody sniffs that out better than teenagers when you're working with them. Like they can get it so quickly. Um, so there, I think with the last one standing in the Southeast area, that was, you know, in North Georgia and North Carolina, is like there was a hub of a few of them. And um, yeah, so one of them closed because they had a second fatality, unfortunately, which is awful, awful tragedy. and a couple of other ones. Just it became an increasingly hostile environment where parents would consider something like wilderness therapy. They go online to Google it. They get hit with all of these awful claims or whatever, and then the price tag on top of that, I think, is pretty unpalatable for a lot of parents, which I understand. Um, I think you had mentioned like hearing some of the abuse, and it's a complicated issue because hundreds of, well, in the industry of wilderness therapy, so to speak, right? Like thousands and thousands of kids are going through that process. And if you're working with a population of folks who, a lot of them are going to have budding personality disorder traits, and they have the internet at their fingers, they're going to dislike, especially if they're coming from a very entitled, very permissive parenting background, and they get put into this environment. It's very tough, even if they are thriving by the end of their stay. Within 2 to 4 months after that, it's not. You would expect that there would be a lot of negative reviews from folks who are dealing with budding borderline traits. Writing
Mhm.
about their experience and the ability to get so much attention online. So that's like one pet piece of it. But there have been some bad actors, and then there are also just some very strange claims. I think one article I remember was like one of their big kind of like punches in the article was like, so these kids have to hike 5 miles a day sometimes. It's like,
Oh,
it's like
no.
nothing,
Not a 5-mile hike when you're 17 and fit.
Yeah, it's like 40-pound packs for 5 miles, and those are small numbers. We would do, and the kids are that's the thing, is the kids would learn that they are capable of doing very hard things like bow drilling a fire without a lighter, without even a striker, but like sticks and string and a rock, and you can make a fire. And so those are pretty powerful experiences, but you cannot create that environment without some risk. And if you keep running that over and over and over again, risk adds up. Things will happen. So they've spent a lot of effort. I would even say they've taken the potency away from the wilderness experience in some pretty key ways, because these programs are hyper attuned, hypersensitive to risk, and they should be sensitive to risk. But it's effectively a hostile environment on the internet for these programs, and so um, where 10 to 15 years ago, a program might have made a choice to allow a tolerable risk level for an activity that had the potential reward of really helping a kid have a breakthrough moment. These programs are now opting for, hey, let's not do that difficult backcountry hike because, hey, if a storm rolls in at 3 p.m., you're going to be setting up shelters out in the backwoods and you're not going to be road accessible. And 10 years ago, that was not an issue. It was like, yeah, get backcountry, make this a tough experience. And I think that philosophy has shifted. The ones that survive are the ones that are very, very tight on risk management.
So I bet you learned a lot about group dynamics in that setting.
Yeah, I would say so. And there are very simple, what I would say, very simple templates that they use for teaching staff those types of things, where it is archetypal. Like I remember looking through the staff manual, and it's like, here are some common characters you might see in your group, like the general. The general recruits other people, isn't often the one causing trouble directly, but you might find him laughing at his peer and egging him on, kind of thing. And like there were these, I don't remember any more than that at this point, but it was like these different characters that they described. And so you start to like, oh, okay, here's these characters I've learned about, these archetypes basically. But the group relations work and Beyond have a much more nuanced structure, a nuanced framework for thinking about groups. Beyond, his ideas were basically that groups, that the unconscious has a mind of its own, and it's very, very powerful, and that there's the explicitly agreed upon purpose for a group or a work group or a team, like a sports team wants to win games. A group at work wants to finish the project on time and deliver a good product. And then there's the hidden contracts, the unsaid goals that are very, very powerful and have like a very strong magnetic pull. BM had three that he thought were primary. I don't necessarily think that there are only three, but his idea was that you see groups get caught in pairing is one of the things that he talked about, where a group becomes fascinated with the relationship between two specific members. I talked about dependence, where, and you probably have maybe experienced this in therapeutic groups, where the therapist or another member becomes like the expert in the group, and everyone else like basically becomes incompetent and defers everything to that member. That's the dependent basic assumption. And fight, flight would be the other one. So like getting mired in conflict or avoidance. And in his eyes, you can look at any group, um, and to the extent that the group is off task or getting distracted, it's usually one of these uh, unspoken, unconscious goals that have been implemented by the group unconscious to meet a need, to be one of the group's needs, and pulls and basically ends up sabotaging the group's um, stated goals, explicit goals.
When I think of group dynamics, one of the first that comes to mind is scapegoating.
Yeah, that's a big one. And it's one of the easiest to teach as well. There's a thinker, it's kind of a rad, uh, maybe like ex hippie guy who lives outside of Asheville. I met him before I had gotten the publishing deal, but he's published a few books, and I think he even owns a small publishing company. His name's Steve Creamy, and one of his papers points out that the etymology of the word scapegoat, I'm going to butcher this. It's in our book. We actually reference him and talk about this, but there's a root etymology similarity between scapegoat and medicine. And so the idea that the group has some affliction, right? Some interrelational turmoil, some anxiety about an external threat, perhaps. One of the ways that the group discharges that emotional energy that's unacceptable to hold is by projecting it onto one member, which is the scapegoat. And you can see that behavior. One of my favorite things to point to with that is Franz de Waal, who's an primatologist. I believe he's still at Emory University, but he noticed that when you watch groups of primates in the zoo, when the interrelational conflicts start to boil over, they will often just band together and start screaming at the tigers next door, who is behind a cage. Can't really like interact with them or anything like that, but it's just like feels so good to have like something to point at, something to scream at. Or alternatively, if it's an internal scapegoating setup, they'll corner one of their members into a corner and like yell at it and throw sticks and stuff like that. And if you remove that member, the activity doesn't stop. They just pick a new ape to put into the corner. Yeah, and we see human groups, maybe not uh, in that exact same context, but that same energy permeates our work groups, our unhealthy work groups, right? Like a healthy work group that's able to metabolize that energy, that has leadership that's able to see these dynamics and intuit how to resolve these kind of conflicts and address that energy that is causing that anxiety. They're not going to have scapegoating dynamics to the same extent. Like a scapegoating dynamic is a symptom of an unhealthy group.
How would healthy leadership, in your opinion, begin to address a situation where scapegoating is starting to develop?
So I would say that if scapegoating is developed, uh, there's already been missed opportunities leading up to that point. One of the pieces that I talk about in the book is that I believe. Let me take just a quick step back. So historically, the scapegoat, the name comes from, I believe it's the book of Leviticus, where they would take a goat and ritualistically load it up with the sins of the community and then walk it out past the community and expel it from the community. And so that's a specific type of way of handling it. What I've seen in groups that I think is also a form of scapegoating is a member gets loaded up with those psychic projections, but the group is really interested in keeping that member around. They don't want to push them out. In fact, they can almost be fiercely defensive of that member because they know that it's like that the member in that dynamic is serving the group in this unhealthy way, but really like scratching an itch for the group effectively. So they don't want to see that scapegoat leave. They want to keep that scapegoat present so that they don't have to face the discomfort and anxiety and the material that they're like projecting out onto that scapegoat. And so Um, in the case where in an organization, if you're a leader, if it feels like there's a scapegoat dynamic happening and then that scapegoat is expelled from the group. And when I say as expelled from that group, that could be the person deciding to leave for another opportunity. Oftentimes it looks like that person just feeling alienated, and if they're talented or able at all, they're going to go find another job a lot of the time. And so you'll see that happen very, very, very often. My one of the points I make is that when that member departs, you have a crucial moment there where there isn't currently a receptacle for all that unwanted psychic energy. And so you can round the group up, and basically like the rapport is going to be good among the remaining members. And you can like point it out, say like, hey, look, we had this situation where we really blamed Jonathan over here for a lot of the failings that we've experienced recently, a lot of the frustrations. It's no secret that many folks in here, and maybe myself included, have at times blamed Jonathan for that. Whether or not that's true, right now we can look around the room and honestly say like we don't have beef, and there's not blame going around within this current membership, right? Like the person who we were putting that blame on is gone. Let's take a moment to consider that now if we start experiencing those familiar feelings again, it's likely a dynamic within our group and not that other person's fault, right? Because currently we've tested the hypothesis that it's all Jonathan's fault. He's gone. If if we start feeling the same way and blaming again in that same style, it's us at that point. And so there's a moment. I don't think the way I just said it was the most eloquent. You got to know your team, but there's a moment to like highlight that there's nobody worthy of being scapegoated in that moment. And people will nod along because they have not nominated it. Once a scapegoat's been nominated, it becomes a lot heavier lifting to try to adjust that. I'm not saying that that's impossible. And my suggestions to leaders is always, I would say, like having conversations to build awareness around that potential dynamic, educating your team about what a scapegoat dynamic is. I think you're generally going to have more success, like working with key members to help them understand what that dynamic is and how it might be playing out like separately rather than trying to preach to a mob, to a group, because whenever you try to educate that group, you're dealing with the group unconscious, which is very, very powerful. And it likes what it's getting from the scapegoating dynamic. That was one of the tools I would say I learned in the woods, is that when we needed to shift a dynamic, a lot of the time pulling kind of key stakeholders or ringleaders from the group and kind of doing a mentoring session and helping coaching them through like a healthier way to see the dynamic, to see what was going on, would go a lot farther. You kind of like build an alliance with them, do that with a couple of two or three people, and then you bring everyone into the group. And so members are primed to kind of be a little bit more agreeable to another way of seeing things rather than just running up against a psychic brick wall of an angry group.
Many of you listening to this show are concerned about an adolescent or young adult you care about who's caught up in the gender insanity and therefore at risk of medical self-destruction. I developed ROGD Repair as a resource for parents just like you. It's a self-paced online course and community that will teach you the psychology concept and communication tools the families I've consulted with have found most helpful in understanding and getting through to their children, even when they're adults. Visit rogdrepair.com to learn more about the program and use promo code SOMETherapist2025 at checkout to take 50% off your first month. That's rogdrepair.com. Yeah, one thing I find myself reminding people of often in my work is that most of us are pretty invested in seeing ourselves as good people and not as bad guys, right? And so if we're engaging in some kind of bullying behavior, if we're treating others with less respect than they deserve, then our subconscious mind is going to get to work justifying to ourselves why we're still in the right and they deserved that. And that can make it really hard, especially if these patterns go on for a long period of time. That can make it really hard to reverse these dynamics, especially where I see them crop up, which is in families, but workplaces just as much, right? Because these people who are engaging in the scapegoating behavior genuinely believe that the problem lies with the other person and that they're not wrong. for what they've done. So I feel like that creates this major subconscious hurdle to transforming group dynamics.
And the scapegoat themselves is cooperating with this unspoken agreement, right? Like I've seen a very wild example that I talk about in the book too, in this Boston conference where a middle-aged, by all accounts, I think pretty intelligent uh, therapist was just cannibalized as a scapegoat by the group. And what was shocking to me is that as that energy built up and like more and more focused anger towards him emerged, he started acting differently too. He started acting in a way that encouraged it. I was what so he I'm not gonna say his name, but he was a gay middle-aged man. I would guess pretty liberal background, which at these conferences in Boston, that's like, you should be kind of the golden child in that group or whatever. Um, but he said some comment that was a little bit ambiguous and maybe sounded like negative towards Obama or something like that. And you could feel like people rustle. And it was a 5-day conference, so, like, by day 3 or 4, he was, like, becoming less aware of his body. I would watch him, like, hang back over his chair, and his hand would be, like, in this, a woman's, like, personal space, like, kinda near her, like, crotch even, like, behind him, and he was just unaware. This is, like, a gentle gay man. He's not, like, predatory or anything like that, but he became less and less aware of his body. He played more and more into the character that they wanted him to be. And so, we look at that as there's an unsigned contract. The scapegoat is certainly miserable in some ways, and this is a part that's a little bit hard for people to digest. They're also getting something from the experience. There's something about like you're getting attention from the group in some way. You're getting if you're that type of scapegoat I mentioned before, where they're protective of you. You kind of know that your role in the group is fairly solid. There's no ambivalence or ambiguity. Like this guy got angry and stormed out of the room for a minute and the group just felt so lost. Everyone was kind of like awkwardly silent. And he picked what was I would still say one of the top comedic timing moments. Like he waited just the awkward perfect amount of time to open the door again to come back and sit down in the seat. And it was like, okay, now we're back. We have our scapegoat again. It was like almost like a sigh of relief. The whole group was like, oh, okay, we have the guy we can blame. But he came back. Like there was something pulling him back into that. Um, so I think that's worth highlighting, and it's like a tough truth, especially if you're a leader who's dealing with somebody who is distraught that they're caught in that scapegoating dynamic. People generally, it's going to be hard for them to hear that kind of theorizing if they're in an emotionally unstable place at the moment and they're really feeling like they're getting worked over by their coworkers or the group. To say like, "Hey, what's your role in it?" is a challenging piece to put in front of them.
It's probably not the moment. I could say this as someone who's been in that
Yeah,
role many times in my life. Projective identification is a fascinating process. So for the, listeners without a psychology background, it's basically a term for this thing that Brant's describing whereby someone takes on and begins to act out that which has been projected onto them because we all affect each other so much. Um, and, there's science to back up the fact that our heart rhythms and brain waves sync up in the physical presence of other people. So, why wouldn't our unconscious dynamics affect each other? And why wouldn't we start to take on the things that are projected onto us? So, one of the things I'm hoping to address today is the positive side of that, how we bring out the best in people. Some of the things you said up front about um, positive workplace culture where someone can leave and the place not fall apart. But
right,
as
right.
someone who's been in that projected onto scapegoat role, you start to feel trapped. And when you start to feel really victimized in that role and you look for help, it's definitely not the moment for the people you turn to for help
Right.
being like, well, why did you put yourself in this position, Stephanie? Are you looking for attention? Like
Yeah.
that's not the moment. But I've definitely, once I've gotten to a place of safety, away from situations in which I felt harmed, needed to do some self-reflecting on why do I keep finding myself, in the same relationship dynamics over and over and over again. But you have to do that from a place of feeling like you have free will.
For sure. I don't know if I'm assuming Beyond probably said this. In my mind, I'm thinking that the way we say it is a little bit different, at least in the book. But my belief is that our own individual anxieties act as like surface area Velcro for those roles to stick, right? And so,
That's a
I've
really
been,
good way of putting it.
yeah. So like I think any human who's gotten to my age has been scapegoated before. I could think of a few of those instances, but one of the things that I've realized over time in doing this work is that you're going to get nominated, or the group is going to try to trial run different members into these different roles to see which sticks. Like the word they use in group dynamics work is, who has a valence for what. And if you like, a lot of the time you'll have a member become indignant, like during a conference, I'm talking about, will become outraged even about some imagined thing you did or said, and they'll voice that, or they'll take a jab at you. And what I've found, this is easier said than done, but is if you just like listen to the person, you go, they might call you whatever kind of name, and you just take it in, but don't really react. The interest drops away. People want to
Oh,
like,
yeah.
yeah, if they need you to push back before there can be a dynamic. It's like the pieces won't fit
Yeah,
if you're Teflon.
totally. Yeah, it's the sort of biggest memory in my adult life of being scapegoated was a tea group that was a required part of a grad school retreat at the beginning of my master's in counseling program. And so I was in this group with like 12, 13 people. And the rules of the group were that you had to basically stay together in the same room for hours at a time, and you couldn't leave. And you had to only talk about what was happening in the here and now, in the present. You couldn't make small talk. You couldn't do things that people normally do to create some ease in, new social environments. So of course it's just a very confrontational atmosphere from the beginning. And the thing that set the scapegoating off was like it was such a little nothing burger. It was now it might not sound like nothing when I say it, but it was this Mexican woman said something about her fear of racism or like experience of feeling like a minority or something like that. And I don't remember the words that came out of my mouth, but I know it was coming from a good place. I know it was innocent. I know it was like basically like, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear you feel that way." Like it was it was like uh it was definitely intended to be sympathetic, but like I don't know, I picked the wrong word and suddenly they're all like, "Oh, white lady's commenting on racism. Let's perk up our ears and see if we can find fault in what she's saying." And the reason that it stuck to me is because that was my childhood wound, that I was the little white kid at the black school where, the Rodney King riots were my fault. The history of slavery was my fault. Like I was a scapegoat from day one over race issues. And so for me, you can't just like throw that at me and have it not stick. Of course I'm going to become defensive. Of course I'm going to be like, no, 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 that's not what I meant. Like, and so it's
Well, that's
it's that
yeah.
defensive reaction, that surface area for the Velcro to stick to. And it's really taken me until my late 30s. Despite all of my experiences that should give psychological wisdom, it's really taken me to having a very, I think, robust personal life, being well loved at home, like being confident in my career to be able to be that Teflon, like you described, where you just don't react to the accusation.
Yeah, I mean, it's you can see it in the evolving discourse online. I think that not everyone's there, but a large portion of the what I would call thinking conservatives on X, they don't care if they're called a racist anymore. There's this show Silicon Valley where one of the characters is named Jin Yang, and he's this like ridiculous, like stereotypical Asian character or whatever. But he has some interaction with the character, and he's like, "Oh no, they're gonna do this because of their skin color or whatever." And the guy's like, "That's racist." And he's like, "Yes, I am racist." And there is no shame there, and the charge goes away, and that's like where like the humor is in it. But yeah, I think that to me is just so true. Is if your insecurities become known and become useful to the group, like that is the surface area for unwanted roles to stick.
And can we talk about what a no-win situation this creates for, in general, white liberals? Because there is this notion of white fragility, right? And then there's anyone who's looking through that lens, looking for evidence of this thing they call white fragility. You can take anything well-intentioned, anything coming from, a tender heart and frame it as fragility. So you're in this kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And really, what I hear is this collective exhaustion with how white people act when they're afraid of being called racist. But the solution to that is to, you know, on the individual level, you have to stop caring, like you're saying, about being called racist, about being called anything. Just like you say, not let it stick to you because there's no place where it can get in. But on the collective level, maybe like stop behaving as if that's the worst thing you can call a person, as if like there's this constant waiting to pounce energy. But I think I see a lot of people kind of halfway on their way out of that way of thinking, but not realizing how the whole thing kind of reinforces itself. People are essentially in a double bind as long as they're living with any degree of fear that anyone pointing that finger and calling you that name means anything.
Yeah, it's like a Zen koan almost situation where, if you in order to be somewhat immune to that, you have to like really not care if you're like people come to, you or whoever the group leader, the group therapist, the consultant, whatever, and they're like, "How do I make the group not think I'm a racist or a bad guy or a scapegoat or whatever it is?" And the answer is like, "Well, you can't care if they think that." And so it's like as soon as you like really don't care, then there is no more like incentive for the group to try to put that on you because it's no longer like this dynamic. It's just like, how long do you want to throw eggs at a concrete wall?
What do you think about humor as a way out of this? I'm thinking of 2 examples. So one is, I have stepkids growing up in this environment, and one of them is pretty funny, and he says, "That's racist," flippantly a lot. Like, if you say the brown one, he'll be, "That's racist." Like, if you name a color, he'll say, "That's racist," like, and I think he's learning that if you just kind of, play the racist card until exhaustion, it becomes funny. And then the other example that comes to mind is Matt Rife. Have you seen his,
I
comedian
know he
Matt
is.
Rife?
I don't know if I've not seen a ton of his stuff, but I know I'm familiar.
Oh, so for people who don't know, Matt Rife is he's a young comedian who does a lot of crowd work, and there's a lot of clips I've seen on social media of him, like, teasing his crowd, and I watched his full Netflix Christmas special, and he he seems like, on the one hand, pretty liberal, but on the other hand, he recognizes that in this cultural climate, as a young, good-looking, heterosexual white man with all the so-called privilege, that in that role, the best thing he can do is kind of poke fun at the fact that everyone is so on edge about racism all the time, and I love the way he pulls that off because he's almost like, "If I can get us all to agree that we're gonna laugh at how ridiculous it is that everyone's constantly on edge about, 'Oh, no, racism,' then, like, maybe it won't be such a boogeyman anymore."
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason Robert Bly writes extensively about the jester archetype and the role of the jester in like the king's court, so to speak.
Mm.
And it wasn't just entertainment. Like the jester is the one person that can say the hard truths to the king without worrying about consequences because he's a fool. Oh, I'm just a fool. Um, like any archetype, there's the shadow side to that, right? Like there's the the shadowy version of that, which I would even argue people like Jon Stewart have recently spearheaded, where it's like hey, I'm just a comedian, I'm just asking questions, like you don't have to take me seriously, but really they are like planting intentional seeds. Um, and I think humor can definitely be used in like shadowy ways to deflect, to evade, to cover for insecurities, to cover for anxiety. And then there's, I think, like really healthy, beautiful ways that it comes out too. So I don't think that there's like a simple answer to that question. I think that being kind of hip to the jester archetype and the role that the jester plays in the metaphorical kingdom of speaking truth to power and making truth palatable through humor and laughter is important. And um, yeah, you get a sense for, especially if you're working with clients or whoever, right? Like who the folks that use humor as a way to hide, use humor as a way to evade, um, to stay stagnant. To sometimes it's to put like the scapegoating dynamic on somebody else. Sometimes it's to keep the scapegoating dynamic. Like humor is a beautiful tool, and it can be misused. Is my take on it.
It's a good point. So, speaking of things that can be positive, you had said towards the beginning that you were fascinated by positive workplace cultures. I've seen just so many examples of group dynamics gone wrong.
Yep.
So, I think that's a valuable reminder. What are some of the qualities of a healthy group?
I mean, I think that they are a little less exciting to analyze, and so I appreciate you bringing that up because the stuff if we're studying group dynamics, it is really exciting to expose the toxic things, and they're very interesting to talk about. Um, Effectively, at least from the Beyond's perspective, like an effective group is one that's engaged with what he calls the work group, which is just another way of saying it's aligned the behaviors and the actions are aligned with the stated goals. So if you're a company, that would be like the mission statement. Like are things set up in such a way to where teams are actually working towards the things that they say they're working towards? Um, I'd say traits of healthy organizations would include things like uh, assertive communication and an expressed appreciation for assertive communication, like both of those, not just that's how that people talk, but like I think like a core understanding the core shared values around assertive communication, why that's important as opposed to like passive or aggressive communication. Um, I think that there are a lot of ways that hierarchical setups can go awry. Like generally it's like one little factoid is that I believe 6 to 8 is like the ideal team size for any individual project, right? Like if you have teams that are bloated, that's going to be a ripe ground for people to feel insecure because they're not providing as much value towards the goal because there's like a bloated headcount on the team. So, that anxiety is going to be managed one way or the other. Um, Leaders that are promoted, I'm just kind of going all over the place here. So I maybe try to tie this into a more cohesive statement. But I think another thing we talk about is the promotion process. Again, like getting back to values first. Are leaders promoted because they did a good job at one level, but don't necessarily have leadership skills around getting other people involved and empowering people underneath them? You can get like these hyper competent people who at one level of the organization, but if you promote them, they fall apart because they're not able to delegate effectively. They're not able to communicate broader visions. So you have to pay attention to things like that. Um, Otherwise, you'll end up with a team that is addicted to crises. We call it the crisis compulsion. But if you have leaders that have been promoted because of competency, say you have an organization where there's an excellent therapist at like let's just say like a recovery center for adult men or something like that. Um, and they're an excellent therapist. They get their notes done. They're always punctual. They communicate well with clients. They get good results. They know how to talk people down and really like tune to clients, and they're good with the staff. That doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to balance budgets, that they know how to hire staff, that they know how to um, communicate the vision of the company and the hard decisions that have to come down the pipeline. A lot of times, people that are hyper competent and then moved up become micromanagers, and worse, become addicted to crises because they know how to put out a fire really well, and so they feel valued. They feel like they're able to make highly visible sacrifices that are appreciated in the moment. Um, and so, like, that would be another kind of sinister way things can go awry. But avoiding those things and hiring based on first principles, emphasizing communication lines, and just keeping like a really um, fastidious eye on where the group behaviors are relative towards the goals that that they're trying to accomplish. Any variance from that is a symptom of an unconscious pull in another direction.
You said
A
a
little bit,
couple of
yeah,
things there that really stood out to me. One was that sometimes people get promoted because they're really good at what they do, but the role they get promoted into is actually more off target for them. Like they were in the perfect role. And the other thing I heard you say that was profound was about people getting sort of addicted to putting out fires.
yep,
Maybe these are people who operate best in when there's an element of urgency, and it makes me think from a slightly different angle about a job that I had where I felt like the workplace group dynamics were fairly toxic, and I've analyzed that from a lot of angles, but this is kind of helping me think about like, yeah, it did always feel like we were putting out fires, and it felt like the person in charge got a sort of thrill out of that.
right, right,
Um, and, there would be things like, for example, in that workplace, one of my main complaints was that it was really inefficient. Like, for example, meetings would go on for hours, things were really unstructured, there was a lot of chaos, it felt like things were just not organized in a way that I could see my clients, get my notes done, complete my basic tasks, and
right, right,
and so it felt like I was in a double bind, and it felt like most of us were in a double bind because on the one hand, there's all this pressure to be really social and, like, everyone's hanging out in the boss's office. If you wanna be in favor with the boss, you gotta hang out and talk all day and, like,
right,
consult on
right,
cases and go to these meetings that go over, but on the other hand, you need to get your notes done and see as many clients as you can. So, it's like, well, there's only 40 hours in a work week, so which of those 2 things do you want me to do? Do you want me to hang out with the boss and talk for hours and gossip and or do you want me to get my work done?
and if you are the voice that puts your hand up, a lot of the time you are volunteering then for, like, the
To be the
group's not gonna
scapegoat.
thank you for that, right? Like, this is one of the core tenets that I think, is one of a great takeaway from unconscious group roles and understanding of that, is that the group is doing what it's doing for a reason. And if you interrupt that process, whether as a facilitator or as a team member, and say, "Hey, what are we doing here?" You're going to get dirty looks because you're interfering with the group's accomplishing whatever that enjoyment it is getting from that process. And so, like in that case, I don't know if this is probably not correct, but one interpretation might be right that the group that these meetings running over and all of this like extra socializing is a way that the group is like running away from something, right? Like a flight response or something. That would be like one hypothesis BN might make, and then look for data to support it. But if you raise your hand and say, "Hey, you guys are," I think we're in a flight response here. Um, you're interrupting the group dealing with its anxiety. You're disrupting the satisfaction that it was getting from running because you're now shining a spotlight and exposing it, and you're not gonna be loved for it generally. You know, there are getting back to like the healthier side of things, like a group that really, really builds on a culture of not getting stuck in analysis paralysis, but openly celebrating and building reward structures around people that identify ways that the group is getting off task, and in a team based manner, can address those and bring a voice to that. Like that being rewarded would be a countermeasure kind of thing, which is a lot of work to build that. But there's been so many times where I'm like, oh, I see what the group is doing, and I've learned somewhere along the way. Probably took me a longer time than it should have. That like you don't. No one like wants to hear your brilliant interpretation. You'd think that oh, this is great. This is going to make us like more productive. This is gonna make it so clear what we're supposed to do. It's going to clarify roles and all this. And a lot of the time, you get dirty looks. People like, oh, this person. I don't know if you had that experience or not.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, it was like, we'd go to our meetings and be told about all the things that we need to be getting done that aren't getting done, and you need to not be behind on your notes, people. We're being
Right.
audited soon. Everyone needs to catch up on your notes. But then it's like, well, why aren't you hanging out in the boss's office and talking all day? Are you not part of the team? It's like, what do you want to get me my notes done or what? But like the one
And
time, the one time I remember feeling like my boss liked me at that job was a day that I happened to be in her office while everyone was talking about whatever nonsense they were doing instead of working. And she was being really stressed out about something. and I decided to play along, and I was like, "Do you need to see videos of puppies and babies?" And she let me show her cute videos of puppies and
Uh,
babies, and she liked me that day, and I was like, "Okay, that's what she's looking for. She's not looking for me to get my notes done, she's looking for me to
so
be an
as a
emotional support."
like when I hear that story, my group dynamics brain wants to ask, first of all, like, what is the purpose? What is the function? What is the organization accomplishing by keeping therapists in that state of anxiety and being pulled thin, right? Like there's an intention behind there, like an
Mm,
unconscious intention. Because if you're feeling it,
yeah,
you're holding it. Your peers are probably holding it as well. And so, like, why
yeah.
is it that the organization feels this compulsion to keep the therapist spread thin and feeling and like holding anxiety for the system? And then the other one is, like looking at what kind of leader, and I don't have a lot of information, but you know, we um we always try to have this lens of what type of leadership is permitted to exist by the group. And what I mean by that is that there's this old Freudian idea and probably like a more like kind of Western idea of like the leader is like in charge and intentional and sees everything and is like omnipotent and smart. And the reality usually is that the leaders are like tolerated by the groups, or elected by the groups to represent their interests in some way. And so you don't have to reach far, probably in your memory. I don't know, but I certainly don't. To think about times where the formal leader of an organization or of a group is really pretty powerless because the group unconscious has decided that they don't represent the current important unconscious goals of the group, and so they kind of like disregard the leader. The other members emerge as like having informal power. But that question of in the case of you, the boss you're talking about, where there really was like a social pull, like why? What is this boss doing with this kind of like off productivity behavior? Like, what is that accomplishing for the group? What is that doing for the group unconscious? Like, what is the reward system there?
Well, when you talk about it keeping therapists spread thin, um, I think it's about sort of a codependent notion of what it is to be a healer, that, you have to be feeling as bad as your clients are feeling, and we were working with a high acuity population. I'm not gonna say what job this was, but I'm gonna say we were dealing with people in crisis, and, it's my philosophy that if you're working for and with people in crisis, that all the more reason you need to stay grounded, all the more reason you need to take care of yourself, organize yourself when you're at work, have good boundaries, but I think that I will say it was not all mental health professionals on the team. It was an interdisciplinary team, including people,
Yay.
without training in psychodynamic theory,
So much fun.
and I think, some of a lot of people who enter the healing and helping professions have codependent backgrounds themselves. Maybe they were their mom's therapist, or maybe they,
Sure.
cleaned up after their dad's alcoholic binges, or, so people sort of confuse love and care with being in the muck with someone. And so I think there was almost this like tall poppy syndrome where you as a therapist or as someone working with this troubled population can't be too well yourself, because then that means you don't care about these people.
Right.
When
Right.
it's my belief that the opposite is true.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, it's like almost a little bit of like a martyrdom type of thing going on there.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think for the therapists in the audience, a lot of so I'd say probably a lot of my listeners are parents because they're worried about their trans identified kids, but then maybe the second most common group of people listening to this podcast are therapists, including therapists in training, therapists in grad school and internships, a lot of whom are like, "I don't know if I can hang with this industry. It is so woke. There's so much
Yeah, it's
nonsense."
rough. It is rough. There's I would say to your point about that. Well, are you familiar with Nathaniel Brandon at all?
I don't think so. Who's that?
He was a PhD psycho, and that's it wasn't in psychodynamics per se. He wrote a lot about self-esteem, and so he's got probably like 4 or 5 books on that topic. One of them that I think is a masterpiece, is, The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, but, if I take little bits of his ideas around that and embed them into the group dynamics thinking, kind of synthesize that. And like one of the things that I think that his ideas in a group dynamics lens might say about that situation you described would be that if you have a deficit in self-esteem at the highest levels of the organization, like if those people aren't solid, if there's insecurities there, it's likely that they would look out and be very uncomfortable and triggered by seeing therapists thriving and not exhibiting signs of anxiety. It's very unsettling if you have insecure leaders who don't understand they don't feel like competent to handle it. To see it's threatening basically to see solid therapists with good boundaries doing work and going home with a smile at the end of the day. That's like dark and threatening for leadership that lacks basic self-esteem.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah.
You know, it was a mostly female environment, and they even had sometimes their body image issues would actually make themselves pretty known. I was one of the reasons I was targeted is I was considered thin, and that's funny because I don't consider myself thin. Like, right now, I'm actually 20 pounds overweight. I'm a lot heavier than I was then, but, like, I still like, I've never been a thin person. I've just been, like, not overweight. But there were a lot of women with body image issues, and sometimes that would surface and someone would say something, let something slip that I'm like, "Oh, they don't like, it was, like, me and, like, a handful of other people who weren't overweight that they were,
Right.
like that I realized that that was actually some of what was going on. So, yeah, the self-esteem stuff.
The I would recommend Nathaniel Brandon's book over mine.
Mm.
It is
Oh,
so
don't
good.
say that. You're here to
No,
pitch
no,
your
no.
book.
I'm just shooting you honest. For most people, I mean, we talk about his ideas in there, but I think for
Mm.
most people, first of all, it's the weirdest thing because I think the first time I tried to read it, I was like, ah, boring. And then I don't know, something clicked. Like I was years into my journey in the therapy world, and I read it, and I was like, oh, this is an absolute masterpiece. And then I tried to hand it to a bunch of people, and everyone's like, ah, boring. And I got like maybe a couple of my friends who are like, oh. So I think it's like you kind of have to have been a little seasoned to even find it as interesting. But to me, like his connections are just phenomenal. Like understanding the just how a deficit in one's ability, one's like efficacy and self-image impacts relationships on such a deep level. That doesn't sound like super revolutionary or revelatory, but um he really goes into depth and dials it down. And in my work of looking at how organizations and how teams and how groups work, you cannot, it's a huge factor. Like the self-image of the leadership and those who actually wield power is like something that gets amplified and um, is one of the most ripe pieces for creating dynamics. So I highly recommend that book. I've been trying to get Ryan to read it. He's too busy podcasting, I guess. But it's phenomenal, and I think it should. To me, it's like Carl Rogers' ideas around how therapy should be conducted, like end up being a pretty solid groundwork for a lot of people to like start off with some of that. I look at the self-esteem lens as similar. And I'm not saying that as a seasoned therapist, but as somebody who's been in leadership roles and has studied groups. I think having that background and just having read that book and understanding that lens is extremely, extremely helpful for both, me as a facilitator, as a consultant, and recognizing like the processes that are going on here and how those are impacting the relationship. It's a slightly different take than anything I've seen from, other big voices in that world of therapy, and it's very, very valuable.
Are you a therapist in need of continuing education that's not over the top woke? Check out my colleague Lisa Mustard's pod courses. All of her pod courses are approved by the National Board for Certified Counselors. Right now, Lisa is offering my listeners an incredible deal. Get all 27 pod courses for only $44. That could meet almost all of your continuing education needs for the year. Visit lisamustard.com/podcourses and use code SOMETHERAPIST to take $5 off of her $49 pod course bundle. Again, use code SOMETHERAPIST at lisamustard.com/podcourses. I'll include that link and coupon in the show notes for your convenience. All right, now back to the show. Well, I'm not quite sure what all you mean when you say the self-esteem lens, but here's what comes to mind is that there's a lot of power in a leader with a noble mission whose personal needs are already fulfilled in every other way except for their need for generativity, their need for, contributing to the community. And if this person doesn't have issues with things like envy, which, I did a great conversation on this podcast with Dr. Natalie Martinek about unconscious envy and group dynamics.
Nice.
Her work probably blends really nicely with yours. Things like envy, right? Like it's, truly at heart, is your core experience one of feeling blessed and grateful for the gifts? I'm a Christian, so the way I would say is the gifts God gave you, um, the gifts that you have, and equally blessed and thankful that um, God gave other people other gifts that you didn't get, right? And how wonderful that we get to coexist in a world where other people bring other talents to the table. And if a person has issues with unconscious envy, resentment, ingratitude, they're not grateful for their own life, or they don't see what their own gifts are, and can't see their limitations with honesty either, then I can imagine any of those getting in the way of really sort of the positive side of that projective identification piece we talked about earlier, which boils down to what we bring out of each other. I think so much of group dynamics come down to, and especially one-on-one dynamics as well, what we bring out of each other, because each of us is so multifaceted, right? It's like which side of you is going to connect to someone else.
And your point around the projections and projective identification, where does that come from? I don't know if people think about it this way, but we project the psychic material that we cannot accept about ourselves. And that process starts way early when you're an infant, right? Like you learn pretty quickly. As like little baby mammals, we're completely helpless. And so we have to like figure out how to be cute and um
Lovable.
lovable. Yeah, exactly. And so that process starts quickly we learn that, hey, it's not okay for me to express this part of myself or like let this part of myself show. And you like tuck those things away, and you as an adult, like the things that you are not able to be at peace with that are true about you, that's the material that then we project, right? So if I have like a father wound where I never felt good enough for my dad or something like that, right? Like, and I'm not able to, and I'm like, I haven't like healed and become whole with this idea, and I'm looking for approval from the father figure, and I haven't integrated that father figure. Like, I'm gonna project that then onto my boss. Like, that's the father, and you can do the work and integrate these things. It takes a lot of time and like painful work, but um, no one's no one ends up being perfect. But the person that you're describing, right? Like things like the envy, the body image issues, like those are pieces that are unintegrated, that are floating around, that don't have a home, that cause deep anxiety. And so then when something in the environment or a person that we're in a relationship with at work, we're able to like kind of attach it to them and either project the bad thing or sometimes the good thing. It's like, oh, like Mark is so creative. God, Mark's the creative guy at work. And so I'm going to go to him for these ideas. Like now I've outsourced my creativity because I was made fun of for my artwork when I was in second grade or something. Like this actually happened to me. I was like really good at art, and this kid I was friends with was like mocked me for it. And I was like, well, I'm not going to try at art anymore. And, um, like having to rediscover where like that creativity lives in you, that's going to keep you from looking for a guru in an unhealthy way later on, for example. Um, Nathaniel Brandon, let's see, what was I going to say? Yeah, he defined this is important, and I should say it. I should have said it earlier. Like, if you grew up in the 90s, there was this like push for all the kids to have self-esteem. And it's like a word that everyone hates now because it sounds so smarmy and stupid. But what he's talking about is having a sense of efficacy, which is the answer to the question, can I adapt and thrive in my environment, should be yes. That's very important. That's efficacy. And then the other one is, am I at a fundamental level worthy of love? And those two pieces together are the concept of self-esteem. And so you can have somebody who's hyper competent, and we've seen people like this, I'm sure you have, I have, they're very capable, and they don't doubt their efficacy, but they really like still have something missing where they don't feel like worthy of, in your language, I would guess, like God's love effectively, right? And like grace. They don't feel worthy of that. And that's a person that's going to find a way to self-sabotage because they don't believe they're worthy of success. And then the flip side of that is true too. Like you can like build all these affirmations and try to like basically feel entitled to love, but without adjusting to your environment and adapting and becoming effective at meeting your own needs and the people around you and providing, you'll never have real self-esteem either. And there's going to be a hole, and that hole is going to become where, it's like a conduit for anxiety that then affects all these relationships around you and these dynamics form. And is that piece about your environment is important because, like, if I'm an engineer in like the 1900s working on the railroads, that's like the environment's demanding different things of me. Like my setup for self-esteem is very, very context and environmentally dependent. Um, and his other point, which is really important, is that both good self-esteem and bad self-esteem are self-reinforcing. So if you have bad self-esteem, you will allow people to talk to you in more disrespectful ways. You won't challenge it. You'll, you press the snooze button on the alarm and you go, "Well, that's who I am." Like somewhere inside you, a voice says that. And it's funny because I overslept my alarm today. But if you have worse self-esteem, you dress less crisply, and then people see you and reflect that back to you. And so your actions, you can get off of that track and start behaving as if you have good self-esteem, and that will then build self-esteem up. It's different than fake it till you make it. That's not what it is, but it's like making choices that reinforce a version of you that reflects back like these good qualities and efficacy in the environment. Making a hard choice to learn how to be more capable and productive and self sufficient then leads to more decisions that empower that type of behavior. So, I'd never heard anyone quite elucidate that concept. Just this idea that we're either on like upward spiral with our self-esteem or we're on a downward spiral with our self-esteem, and that the actions influence our self-esteem and that self-esteem influences our actions. Pretty cool stuff.
Well, I think you're right that the term self-esteem does feel smarmy to a
Yeah.
lot of us, but I appreciate that breakdown. I think that explanation is one that I can get behind, and one reason that I agree with it is because your definition is connected to reality. Right, it's not about creating a fictional alter ego in your head and convincing yourself that you are that idealized version of yourself. It's
Right.
more about
Yes.
behaving in a way that's consistent with the kind of person that you would respect yourself if you were that person. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
more the neuroplasticity element as well of positive versus negative behavior change influencing your everyday experience.
Yeah, it's reality based. And it's crazy and sad to me too that you have to do what we just did to have this big talk around it, because that word really has become like about the least cool word I can think of. Like self-esteem is like, oh, it makes me think of my friend's mom coming into our class in the 90s and preaching to us with some puppets or something like that. And I think people nowadays see it as, like you said, these hollow mantras of like, I am a good person, I am worthy. Having, not to say that mantras can't have a place, but this idea that that's enough to build self-efficacy and self-worthiness, and that's just not how it works.
I talked about this recently on an episode that will air before this episode airs with Pastor Chris Legg. He's both a pastor and a licensed professional counselor. And, I'm new to the Christian faith. And so I've been in a process for a long time of sort of becoming a Christian and seeing how my values align with Christian values and how a Christian framework helps me conceptualize things that I've been thinking about for a long time. And this is one of those pieces where I really feel like um, the Christian perspective on self-esteem resonates for me because it leaves room for our guilt and shame. It leaves room for the knowledge that we are sinners, right? That because I feel like without some framework that allows for some honest voice of self-reprimand to come in,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
like, then you're just constantly trying to puff yourself up and you're in denial about those parts of yourself that you're not proud of, or you're trying to beat down that voice inside that tells you that you're not as good as you could be. And I actually I feel like that part needs room of, yeah, I'm not as good as I could be, but I'm loved anyway and I can be forgiven. Like that to me is kind of the two-part message that I can find some
Yeah.
peace and clarity within.
It fits perfectly. Like, also worth saying is in Nathaniel Brandon's writing, like he talked that compulsivity towards perfection is a symptom of low self-esteem. Somebody with high self-esteem will be more resilient to hearing difficult feedback because they are at ease with this idea of like the truth. They are not in hiding, and so there's a belief it's so great. He's got like, here's an example of beliefs held by people with high self-esteem versus low self-esteem, and one of the beliefs with high self-esteem is that um, new information or feedback is not threatening to me because I'm capable of adjusting and handling the things that life has to throw at me effectively. Another example might be like, well, I don't have to be perfect to be loved. I don't have to be good enough for anyone. Like it's all of these like, they sound kind of mantra-y, but they're really like important core beliefs to connect with, right? Because if we dig down underneath our anxieties, there's usually always, I'll say always. Rarely use that word. Always is going to be a negative and frankly absurd belief behind these anxieties. Generally, let me be careful with my wording here. There's generally a belief about ourselves that if we say it out loud, it sounds embarrassing, and so that's one of the reasons why we hide from it. For me, I remember having the realization, it's like, oh, in wilderness therapy pretty early on, I was like, oh, like when I come in and do in service in these trainings, I feel anxious sometimes. And it's because I believe at a core level that if I don't make these people think I'm smart, that I'm a failure. And it's like, oh, wow. Like as soon as I can get down there and put some air on that belief, that toxic belief that's the root and the kernel behind that anxiety, it's like, okay, well, I don't actually believe that. As soon as I like hold it up to the light and like take a look at it, I can start to dispel that and I can start to like, okay, come on. Like I don't have to prove I'm smart every single Tuesday when I come in for a training. Like that's ridiculous. Like I don't actually believe that, but it's like deep down somewhere along the way, I adopted that belief. And so I'm a really kind of going off on a tangent there, but that's like Nathaniel Brandon talks about the beliefs that are symptoms of our self-esteem effectively. And so being introspective and truly looking at our own anxieties and like what's going on and trying to get to the bottom of it, that is the work of somebody with higher self-esteem. And if you do some of that work, it will increase your self-esteem, it will increase your self-knowledge because um you cannot pretend you don't know that about yourself anymore. Like you're the type of person that has done this work, you're the type of person that is willing to look inside. Um so it kind of like builds on itself.
And yet, when we talk about introspection now, we have to be so careful because there's a line. Sometimes it feels like a fine line between healthy and unhealthy introspection. There's a lot of like self-obsessed rumination, navel
Yeah.
gazing, self-diagnosis is popular in the culture right now. People with
Right.
too much time on their hands, too much time on the internet, too much time watching TikToks about mental illness. And
They've
so
taken the word from us again. It's like self-esteem now, introspection. It's like
yeah, it's like, well, what is healthy introspection? I don't know. When I'm at my best, I am not thinking about myself so much. I'm very loving. Um, and I'm unfortunately, my lifestyle right now doesn't allow me to be as much of a social butterfly as I think I really am by nature. But I think my best moments, I'm like so unself-consciously just interested in other people and affectionate
yeah.
toward them, and, like, if you were to, like, check out my self-esteem in that moment, it's pretty high because it's like, if you ask me what I think about myself, well, obviously, I think I'm worthy of,
Right.
going up to these people and being happy to see them, right? But I'm not thinking about myself so much, and so it's like,
Yeah. I agree with
it's
that.
a
I
maybe
think
a whole other conversation for another day if anyone wants to come on the show and talk about, like, what differentiates healthy introspection that's actually therapeutically productive, that helps you become a better person from just this like endless navel gazing in the culture
Yeah.
that's making people more self-obsessed, more depressed, more obsessive compulsive. They need to get out of their
I
heads.
I love that. I think that's crucial. One thing I would say about it is that you're making me think of Csikszentmihalyi's flow concept. Like when when you're in the flow of that social whatever, like the social situations where you feel like the best is coming out of you, that's like a flow state. And um I think that there's a way to like be in flow state with like some examination too. Certainly not getting caught in it. And I agree with everything you said. I know that I can think of times where I've been in where it's felt right and it's felt important to like meditate and get down into what's going on for me and the limiting beliefs that keep coming up and working through those. And so I think it's like a little bit of a balance. I'm having, of course I say this like as we're getting towards the end here, but I would say that on that topic you just said, I feel like I'm having this slow motion like crisis of faith in the world of therapy and the positive impact of that because I don't look out at all of the people that I staffed in wilderness therapy with and who did all this deep work. Everybody was just about like going so deep inside and like figuring out this and blah blah blah, like navel gazing. I don't necessarily see those people thriving and being people I deeply admire years later. And so it's like that quote from uh what is it? The Road where or no, No Country for Old Men where he's like, if the rule you followed led you to this, of what use was the rule? And I've had that quote bounce around in my head more and more recently. I feel confident that we have not figured out what that balance is around introspection as a culture and as a society, what that balance is around introspection and self-discovery versus, yeah, just going out and living life. Like, I don't think that the people I've known who sit there and think and meditate and introspect all the time, those don't end up being the people I admire.
Yeah, I think, looking at it almost from that reverse engineering standpoint as much that's how I like to think of about things too. So in my coaching work, I talk about what kind of outcome can we realistically achieve, and then how can we plan backwards from that outcome? And similarly, you shall know them by their fruits. Like, look at the outcomes of how people are living their lives, and, who do we admire? Who's living a life that we would trade places with, and what can we learn from their example?
Yeah, powerful stuff.
Well, I wanna respect your timeline. Brant, thank you so much for joining me today. So, let's go over where people can find your book and where they can find you.
Yeah, the book is called God's Heroes and Groups: Relational Dynamics Through Mythic Archetypes, and we didn't talk about myths during this whole podcast, which is kind of funny because a lot of the book is looking at myth as metaphor for how these group dynamics play out. It's available. I mean, probably the easiest is barnesandnoble.com. I think it's on Amazon as well. It's published through Karnak out of the UK. Their website is firingthemind.com. I have a Twitter account. It's at the group lens. And I don't know how great that is. I'm semi-active with it. I think my co-author just recently deactivated his. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This is a really fun conversation.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening to You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. If you enjoyed this episode, kindly take a moment to rate, review, share, or comment on it using your platform of choice. And of course, please remember, podcasts are not therapy, and I'm not your therapist. Special thanks to Joey Pecoraro for this awesome theme song, Half Awake, and to Pods by Nick for production. For help navigating the impact of the gender craze on your family, be sure to check out my program for parents, ROGD Repair. Any resource you heard mentioned on this show, plus how to get in touch with me, can all be found in the notes and links below. Rain or shine, I hope you will step outside to breathe the air today. In the words of Max Ehrmann, with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world.